All right, so this is the step-by-step on your practice test. Chapter 7 is all about factoring and solving quadratics and a couple of higher degree polynomials. These are chunked into different sections. The first one we're going to do is where your a equals 1. What I mean by that is this is the same as 1x squared. So that first one, I can do this in two different ways. So I guess I'll go ahead and do it in two different ways. The first I'm going to do just with grouping. So algebraic grouping, I should say. So that means I have x squared plus something plus 15 equals 0. So these two somethings have to add up to give me 8x. They need to multiply together to give me 15x squared. So what I can do is factor 15. So 1 and 15, 2 doesn't go in, 3 and 5. And then it's not divisible by 4, and then I'm back to 5 and 3, which repeats itself, so that's how I know I have all my factors. Next thing I need to do is consider my positives and negatives. If everything is positive, then everything's going to be positive for your factored form. So 5 plus 3 gives me 8, so this is going to be, 3x plus 5x. So then I need to group this. X squared and 3x have a greatest common factor of x. So I'm going to bring that x down and put it out front. Divide both of those by x. So x squared divided by x is x. 3x divided by x is just 3 because those x's divide out. Plus, my greatest common factor for 5x and 15 is 5. So I factor out a 5. Put it out front. 5x divided by 5 is just x. 15 divided by 5 is 3. And that all equals 0. So now I have a common binomial factor, that x plus 3. So I'm going to put that out front. And once I divide that out, I'm left with x plus 5. Now, the last step in all of these is once you're factored, you use the zero product property. So the very last step is not going to differ a lot in any of these problems that we're going to do. So when you're solving like this, there's a couple things you need to ask yourself. The first is my equation set equal to 0? This one is. Everything with 0 alone on one side. And the next thing you need to ask yourself is it factored? And in most cases, it's not going to be factored, so you have to do that part. So when it comes to using the cheat sheet that you were given, this is always going to be where just kidding, backside solving quadratics using factoring. Where you're going to start with this is asking, does your equation equal 0? If not, get everything to one side. Is your expression factored? And if not, you must factor it. And from there, you're going to start back up at the top on the front side. The place where you start with that is if there is a common factor other than 1, factor out the greatest common factor, or GCF. I'll zoom out just a little way. Then you need to look at how many terms you have. If there are 2 terms, so you're going to look at the difference of squares, which is on the back side right here. All your squares are written down the side, but the number that's squared to get that got cut off. So this is 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, so on and so forth. If you have 3 terms, you want to check and see if it's a perfect square trinomial. It's on the other side as well. You're going to check right there. If you want to use that, if you want to use box and diamond or factoring by grouping algebraically, that is fine too. It's just going to take you a little longer to factor. So if there are 3 terms and it's not a perfect square trinomial, you're going to use one of these 2 methods, whichever one you have decided that you prefer. The box and diamond is fine. Grouping algebraically is fine. It just depends on which one works better for you. If there are 4 terms, you're going to go automatically to grouping. You can also, I didn't put that on there, it's right here. So those examples are right here. You can also use the box for the grouping. Mathematically, it's the same thing. So once you factor, you're going to check and see if there are any more factors that you can pull out of any of the terms, or any of the factors, and then you check by multiplying. That's what you're going to do ideally. On the back side, you also have some guidelines about dealing with negatives and positives. And I use the diamond for a visual because they need to add together to give you the bottom number and multiply together to give you the top. So if I have a negative times a negative, it's going to give me a positive, and it's going to add together to give me negative. If I have a positive and a positive, that's going to multiply to give me a positive and add together to give me a positive. If I have a negative and a positive, they're going to multiply together to give me a negative, but it depends on which one is bigger as to what the smaller, or to what the bottom number is going to be. So if the larger number is positive, then the smaller number is going to, the bottom number is going to be positive. If the larger number is negative, then they're going to add together to give you a negative. So, as I was saying, once we have it factored, that's the lengthier part of the problem, then you're going to use the zero product property to solve. And what that says is if I'm multiplying things together to get 0, then each of the things is going to be set to 0. So here I'm multiplying x times 2x minus 1 times x plus 4. So I set x equal to 0, 2x minus 1 equal to 0, and x plus 4 equal to 0. And then I solve those as 3 separate equations. If you want further explanation on that, see the video on the making of this cheat sheet. So back to what I was talking about. I have x plus 3 times x plus 3 times x plus 5 equals 0. So I'm going to take the x minus 3, which is one of my factors, and set it equal to 0. That's not a minus, that's a plus, sorry. X plus 5 equals 0. And then I'm just going to solve each one. So I've got x equals negative 3, and x equals negative 5. So that is a proficiency level problem for solving when, for skill A, when A is 1. The highly proficient levels on all of these are either going to have more than one variable taken into account. You're not going to have to solve those, just factor them. Or you're going to have to factor out a greatest common factor. They're just going to be trickier problems of the same kind of concept. All right, on the back side of that one is where A is not 1. So we have a 2 there instead. First thing we want to do, does it equal 0? Yes, it does. Is it factored? No, it's not. So I want to factor it. First thing I'm going to do is check for a greatest common factor. 24 doesn't have an x, so I can't take any x's out. My smallest number is 2, so if I divide everything by 2, 13 doesn't give me a whole number, so it's not going to be divisible by 2. So I don't have a greatest common factor here. So I'm going to jump straight into either box and diamond or grouping. I'm going to go ahead and use the box and diamond because it seems like more of my students are comfortable with that particular method. So if you went to Franklin High School, it's likely that's the one that you learned. So we have 2x squared, and then in the opposite box, negative 24. I take those two terms, and I multiply them to give me my top number. 2x squared times negative 24 is going to give me negative 48x squared. My bottom number is going to be my middle term at negative 13x. So what I'm going to do now is factor my top number because I need two numbers that multiply together to give me 48, or negative 48, but I'll get to the negative part. So I always start with 1 in that number. So 1 and 48. Then I do 48 divided by 2 gives me 24. 48 divided by 3 gives me 16. 48 divided by 4 gives me 12. 48 divided by 5 is not a whole number, so I'm not going to list it here. 48 divided by 6 gives me 8. 48 divided by 7 is also not a whole number, and then I'm back to 8 and 6. So that means I have all of my factors. Now, if I look at my cheat sheet, I know that if my top number is negative and my bottom number is negative, that means that only one of my side numbers is going to be negative. And because it has to turn out to be negative, then my bigger number, my bigger factor, is going to be the negative. So I need to look at what these pairs add up to. 1 and negative 48 gives me negative 47. That's negative 22. That's negative 13. So that is the pair that I want to use. So I'm going to do 3x, negative 16x, and I can put those in either box. It doesn't matter which. So now this is where people tend to make mistakes, because with their x squared, a lot of people just do x and call it good. But when you don't have just an x squared, now you have a 2x squared, you have to be careful about where you can divide out a 2x. So you can look at either column or either row. Like if I look at this row, I can't divide out a 2x from 3x because 3 is not divisible by 2 as a whole number. So all I can take out from this row is an x. I can take a 2x out of this because both 2 and negative 16 are divisible by 2. So I can divide that 2x out here. So 2x times x gives me 2x squared. X times 3 gives me 3x. Just 3. Because x times 3 gives me 3x. 2x times negative 8 gives me negative 16, and negative 8 times 3 gives me negative 24. So my factored form is 2x plus 3, I get that from up here, times x minus 8. That all equals 0, so now I'm back to the zero product property. My two factors here are 2x plus 3 and x minus 8. Set both of those equal to 0 and solve them individually. So minus 3 and minus 3, 2x equals negative 3. Divide both sides by 2. So x equals negative 3 over 2. You can also write that as negative 1.5 if you prefer. That's one of my answers. My other one, I'm going to add 8 to both sides of the equal sign, so I've got x equals 8. So those are my two answers. Moving on to the one that has C in the upper right corner. So now I need to look at this. It is set equal to 0, so I don't need to do anything there. It is not factored, so I need to factor it. So when I look at this, if I have two terms, I'm supposed to check if it's a difference of squares. That's what it says right here at the top of my page. If there are two terms, check if it's a difference of squares. What that means is if the first one is a perfect square and the second one is a perfect square and you're subtracting them, you have to figure out what the square roots are and then put them in this form. So I want to know what times itself gives me x squared, that is x, and what times itself gives me 121. So the way I can check that if I don't know it off the top of my head is second. There's that x squared key right there. So second, so that brings up the square root, 121. That gives me 11. So one of my factors is going to be x plus 11 times x minus 11 equals 0. That's my factored form, and I can jump right to that because of that difference of squares. Now, if you want an explanation as to why that works, then you need to go back to the video, the cheat sheet, and watch that part over again. So now that I'm in factored form, all I have to do is the zero product property and solve. So I've got x plus 11 equals 0, x minus 11 equals 0. On this one, subtract 11 from both sides of the equal sign, so I've got x equals negative 11. And over here, add 11 to both sides, so I've got x equals positive 11. And those are my two answers. If I flip over to the back side of that one, I have three terms. I'm equaling 0, not in factored form. So I have three terms, and I don't have any common factors here, because my factors of 9 are 1, 3, and 9. 30 is divisible by 3, but 25 is not, and neither 30 nor 25 are divisible by 9. So the next thing I want to check for is a perfect square trinomial. So that is beneath the difference of squares on your cheat sheet. So what I do is I take the square root of the first term, or I check and see if the first term has a perfect square root, which it does. The last term has a perfect square root as well. So I have 3x, because 3x times 3x would give me 9x squared, plus 5. And the way that I know that's a plus is because that's a plus. So plus 5, and then squared. Now, if this is a perfect square trinomial, these two terms multiplied together, which gives me 15x, and then multiplied by 2 is going to give me 30x. Once again, if you want a more thorough explanation as to why that works, see the video. So, if I am solving this, I've got 3x plus 5 equals 0. Subtract 5 from both sides. So 3x equals negative 5. Divide by 3. So x equals negative 5 over 3. It's a good idea when you do a perfect square trinomial to check and make sure that it actually does work. Do 3x plus 5 times 3x plus 5 and make sure that your middle term ends up being 30x. That's very important. So that is a perfect square trinomial. On the last part, or second to the last part, I should say, start back at your original question. Does it equal 0? Yes, it does. Is it factored? No, it's not. So the first thing I'm going to do in factoring is check for a greatest common factor. I have x squared minus 5x. Those both have an x with them, so I can take out an x. So I'm going to divide both of those by an x, put that x out front, and I'm left with x squared divided by x gives me x, and negative 5x divided by x gives me negative 5, equaling 0. And now I am in factored form, because there's nothing else that I can do with this x minus 5 to factor it any further. That's as simple as that's going to get. So once I'm in factored form, zero product property, my two factors are x and x minus 5. So x equals 0, and that one is simple enough. That's my answer. And x minus 5 equals 0. Add 5 to both sides, and I have x equals 5. And that's it on that one. The very last one is simply factoring by grouping. This is not a solving one. So what I'm going to do is group the different parts that have a common factor. So I'm just going to group the first part and the second part. In the first part, 4x to the third minus 12x to the second are both divisible by x to the second. You're always looking for your lowest exponent there. And then they're also divisible by a coefficient. So 4 and 12 are both divisible by 4. So I'm going to factor out a 4x from both of these. I'm going to take that 4x, put it out front. 4x to the third divided by 4x, I'm left with, I wanted to take a 4x squared, sorry. X to the third divided by x squared is going to just give me x. And then negative 12 divided by 4 is 3. X squared divided by x squared is 1, so those divide out. Drop down that plus sign. 10x minus 30, you can't take any x's out of there, but you can take a 10 out. So we divide both of those by 10, take that 10, put it down front. So I'm left with x minus 3. So I have that common binomial factor, that x minus 3. I'm going to take that out and put it out front, x minus 3, and I'm left with 4x squared plus 10. And I don't have this one equaling anything. This is simply factoring by grouping. So that's the last skill you need on this test. So that is your practice test, step by step. So hopefully that helps. Make sure you finish your reviews and you finish those worksheets that I've given you to get enough practice for your test next class. Good luck.